welcome you. It's time to start. My name is Pascal Lotta. I'm an assistant professor for neutrality studies at the Waseda Institute for Advanced Study. I am very happy to see so many familiar faces and many of you who actually participated in writing this great book, of which I unfortunately not yet have a physical copy, but I just got my digital copy, and I must say this is a massive work, 600 pages, 24 chapters. You authors of this volume worked a lot, and I'm really happy to have you here. Maybe just a very brief introduction. Mark Kramer is the director of Cold War Studies at the Harvard University and a senior fellow of Harvard Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Arjo Mako is the Pro Futura Scientia fellow at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, and an associate professor of history at the Stockholm University, where he serves as the director of the Hans Blix Center for the History of International Relations. Then Kimmo Rentola is professor of political history at the University of Helsinki. Peter Ruggenthaler is the deputy director and a senior research fellow at the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Research on War's Consequences in Graz, Austria. And Nadia Boyadjeva is a professor of international law and international relations at the Balkan Studies Institute of Bulgarian Academy of Science. Just very briefly, before I give the word to Mark, let me say that this book is part of a very long history of neutrality studies, and also is explicitly of the study of some attitudes of belligerence towards neutrals. This goes far back. Another book that I recently got is The Policy of the United States Towards the Neutrals, 1917 to 1918. This question of how belligerents or parties of conflicts acted and reacted to neutrals is quite old. The book is also part of a series of books that have been published recently, among others, Engaged Neutrality by Heinz Gärtner, but also Notions of Neutralities and Permanent Neutrality by Herbert Regenbogen and me. So for some reason, there's more research coming out again in forms of chapters and books. But today we want to hear about the Soviet Union and the Cold War neutrals. Mark, I'll give you the word.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And I'm very pleased to be joined by the audience, and which includes at least one of the other authors, Csaba Békés. And so in a brief introduction, I just want to say that there were two major developments that gave rise to the momentum to produce this book. The first of these was a book that appeared several years ago by Peter Ruggenthaler that was also published in Harvard's Cold War Studies book series. It is about Stalin's approach, Joseph Stalin's approach to neutral countries in Europe, and not just the prospect of neutrality for Germany and Austria, but looking more broadly at neutral countries. But that focused, and it's really an excellent book. That, however, focuses only on the Stalin period. And even though, as Pascal mentioned, there has been a good deal of scholarship for some while, including in recent years, on US policy toward neutral countries, there hadn't really been a comprehensive study of Soviet policy toward neutral countries throughout the post-1945 period, as well as the views within the neutral countries toward the Soviet Union. So that was the idea of this book. And the person, my other co-editor, Arjo Mako, was crucial in developing that idea for a conference held in Stockholm in September 2015 that was the real source of the book ultimately. The papers that were presented there underwent significant revision, and in some cases were totally rewritten afterward. But the book consists of at least a good number of the papers presented there. There were a few that are not in the book. But so that is the idea of it, is to look at both sides of the Soviet relationship with neutral and non-aligned countries. So the non-aligned refers, there are some very small countries in Europe that were also non-aligned. We didn't really see the need to include those because they were never a major focus of Soviet foreign policy. These would be countries like San Marino and Andorra and so forth. So they were not covered, but all of the major neutral countries, with the partial exception of Ireland. Ireland is a very different case, partly because it is outside continental Europe, and its neutrality is shaped in large part by its relationship with Great Britain. And Ireland did have a fairly important relationship with the Soviet Union. It is discussed a bit in a couple of the chapters, but partly for reasons of length, we left out a more systematic discussion of it. But it does focus on the one country that had a long tradition of neutrality, that is Switzerland, which made it quite different. It was also much further away from the Soviet Union than the others, and there was never a prospect of the Soviet occupation of Switzerland during the Second World War, which also made it quite different. So Switzerland definitely figures at some length in the book, as well as Soviet policy towards Switzerland, and but then the other countries that had been neutral, or at least tried to remain neutral during the Second World War, but didn't succeed in that regard. So looking at Sweden, Finland, and then also bringing in non-aligned countries and then later Austria, which Peter Rugenthaler will speak about. But then looking at the one large non-aligned country, which was Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia did not start either as a non-aligned country. It became so after Stalin broke with Yugoslavia and forced Yugoslavia out of the Cominform, Communist Information Bureau, in June 1948. And then for a while, Yugoslavia moved quite close toward NATO, but ultimately did not join NATO. It came fairly close, and certainly developed military ties with the United States and Great Britain, received weapons from them, and so forth, as Nadia Boyajieva will be able to discuss. But Yugoslavia, after Stalin's death, pursued a policy of non-alignment and was instrumental in the formation of the non-aligned movement. And so from that point on was really the one country in Europe you could point to that would clearly regarded itself as non-aligned. There were, as I mentioned, some very small countries that were also non-aligned, partly because no one was looking for them to be aligned with them. But also that they deliberately chose that status. There was no reason for them to try to achieve some status within an alliance. So that's the basic idea of the book, and my colleagues will outline some of the findings from it. I should add, the only last point I want to add now is that there are also chapters on countries that for periods in the Cold War had been aligned with the Soviet Union, and either for a brief while pursued a policy of attempted neutrality, which is covered in an excellent chapter by Csaba Bekes in the book. Csaba's here, so I hope he will say something. And that was Hungary in 1956, in the fall of 1956, when, as discussed in the chapter, Imre Nagy, the prime minister during the revolution, who had been prime minister earlier, but then had been forced out and came back during the Hungarian Revolution, and to try to stave off the the increasing pressure eventually was trying to get some sort of negotiation underway on the question of neutrality. That failed. Soviet troops invaded and with a much larger number of troops and crushed the revolution. And Hungary was eventually Imre Nagy was executed. That was done by the Hungarian leader János Kádár, not by the Soviet Union. But in any case, that put an end to any further such attempts by Warsaw Pact states. However, there was a Warsaw Pact country, Albania, which is also discussed in the book, that de facto became a non-aligned country. It never officially declared itself such, but it broke with the Soviet Union in 1961. Unlike Hungary, it got away with it, and in 1968 formally left the Warsaw Pact. For a while into the early 1970s, Albania was aligned with China. But from that point on, after the Chinese normalization with the United States, which infuriated the Albanians, Albania from that point on became a de facto non-aligned country and played no role at all, the only European country that took no part in the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which comes up a lot in the book, but is not the central focus of the book. It comes up a lot because the book does cover the Brezhnev period and later in some depth. So anyway, that's the basic idea of the book.
Thank you very much, Mark. Then let me second. Thank you for that explanation. Let me now give the word to, I think, Arjo Mako, who's next and who will tell us something about the chapter you wrote on Sweden and Sweden in the book in general. Please, Arjo.
Thank you, Pascal, and thank you, Mark, for the introduction also. I'll give you some of my own background. Being trained as a Cold War historian, I very much profited from the work carried out in the Swedish during the Cold War research program, which resulted in some 30 doctoral dissertations and a total of 50 publications about Sweden's role during the Cold War, Swedish neutrality, and so on. There were also public inquiries carried out during the 1990s when questions about the nature of Swedish neutrality appeared upon the opening of archives in various countries. And after finishing my PhD, which dealt with Sweden's role in the CSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, I discovered that there were a few research gaps, important research gaps, few transnational studies contextualizing Sweden's role in different questions. But maybe the major research gap, simply the eastern side of the Cold War. So little to none materials used from the Soviet Union and other Eastern European states, little attention paid to Eastern perspectives and the Eastern blocs. And finally, also that there was much work left to do on the 1970s and 80s. So that was where I was coming from, trying to initiate new research about Sweden and the neutrals. In the Swedish case, in 1945, when the Cold War was on the horizon following the end of the Second World War, the Swedes kind of returned to a traditional policy of neutrality, which to some extent actually was an invented tradition. When you look at the country's history since 1815, you'll discover that neutrality was compromised on several occasions. What was particular about Sweden compared to its neighbors, but also to Austria or Switzerland, was the combination of dominance from one political party, the Swedish Social Democrats, which were in government during almost all of the 60-year period between the early 1930s and the early 1990s, with the exception of 6 years between 1976 and 82. Sweden successfully stayed out of the war, was not invaded, also by compromising its policy and allowing the Nazis to use Swedish territory in 1944. And also the long-term experience of Swedish Social Democratic Foreign Minister Östen Undén, who was in office between 1945 and 1962, and who rightfully was, or is called, the architect or the father of Swedish neutrality. So basically we see that there are two versions, or two ways of conducting Swedish neutrality that we can distinguish. The first one is Östen Undén's passive but militarily strong neutrality policy, which was formulated as non-alignment in peacetime, aiming at neutrality in wartime, and by the mid-1950s universally accepted. During this early period of the Cold War, the Swedes also not only built the world's 5th strongest air force, but also initiated a nuclear program, actually, which they didn't abandon until 1972. This changed gradually throughout the 1960s, when Sweden abandoned its passive neutrality in favor of an active foreign policy, or active neutrality. And the symbol for that neutrality, which focused more on soft power and the image of a moral superpower, the symbol of that was Prime Minister Olof Palme. Both Palme's rise in the ranks and this policy shift were to considerable extent a social democratic response to the leftist winds among younger Swedes. So the Social Democratic Party during the early 1960s feared that it would lose its younger generation, and understood it had to change its foreign policy. It had to take a different position on global affairs, on Vietnam, on decolonization, and so on. So we do see the shift in the 1960s. Until then, we do now know that there was military cooperation with the West, also prompting the Eisenhower administration to describe Sweden as a neutral on our side internally. But there were also clear boundaries to that cooperation. So it was secret, it was denied when brought up, for example, on various occasions in the British press. It also did not affect official Swedish policy. So, for example, because of the pressure exerted by the Soviets, Sweden stayed away from association with the EEC and European integration. I think some of the findings, or the major finding that I'm also trying to elaborate on in a forthcoming book, is that Sweden, but also the other neutrals in general, were neutral against the Soviet Union rather than between two blocs. So very often neutrality policy during the Cold War was really about finding the right answer to Soviet pressure, or in some instances to what was perceived as a Soviet threat. Also in official policy, was often put as a strict neutrality between two blocs, and as neutral countries that would defend any attack from any direction, and so on. Another finding is also that Swedish-Soviet relations, in my opinion, were much more stable than I had anticipated. There were a few crises, spy games in the 1960s, for example, which sparked public controversy and debate, or the submarine violation of Swedish waters that appeared to be more dramatic than I think they were on a political and diplomatic level. I would also argue that the literature so far has focused very much on Sweden during the Cold War as part of the Nordics, the Nordic bloc, the group of Nordic states attempting to maintain a balance in the northern part of Europe, and that much more attention has to be paid to the increasing neutral cooperation that we see at least from the mid-1970s, and that became much more important by the late 1970s and early 1980s. So I think I'll stop there, and again, thank you to Pascal for putting this together. I do hope the book closes some of the research gaps and opens up for new questions in the future, and helps us covering more of the Eastern and global perspectives that so far I think have been ignored to some extent. Thank you.
It certainly does. Thank you very much, Ario, for that overview of Sweden. Then I would like to ask Kimmo to tell us something about Finland and your chapter that you added to the book. Thank you, Kimmo.
Okay, thank you. There's actually 3 Finnish chapters here, but the Finnish case of neutrality was rather special because after the Second World War, Finland didn't become a people's democracy as other powers between Germany and the Soviet Union. It remained Western and capitalist, but in political and military terms under heavy Soviet influence. And this was confirmed by a treaty in April 1948, which was a military treaty for the case of war. In case of a German attack or by somebody allied with Germany, Finland promised to defend itself against the attack against the Soviet Union through Finnish territory, and if need be, in cooperation with the Soviet Union. So in strict war and peace terms, Finland was not quite neutral, because it had a possible alliance with the Soviet Union in case of a general war. But this treaty was rather limited in the sense that it was not valid for peacetime, and it was not valid for a general war if the war didn't involve Finnish territory. So there were some limits for this, and I think this is the main reason that the Soviet attitude to Finnish neutrality, there was a great variation in this attitude. Sometimes the Soviets, in particular during Stalin's time, sometimes the Soviets thought that Finland is a potential ally for them in a war. But then they thought that it might be a potential enemy in a general war, because it's Western. And neutrality was slowly seen as a real change, even for the real chance, even for the Soviet influence, and after Stalin's death. There was a brief period during this German note period, but it was very brief. But after Stalin's death, the Soviets saw that this kind of neutrality, which Finland tried to fix for itself, might involve some chances for them also. And I think this was influenced by the developments in rather distant countries. Soviet relations with Egypt, Soviet relations with India. They thought that this model might produce something even in Europe. And also this kind of Finnish special neutrality was interesting for other countries in Europe, in particular for Austria during 1950s, because examining the Finnish case, the Austrians were able to develop ideas what kind of neutrality would be acceptable for the Soviet Union, what they would swallow and what not. It was not so much for Sweden. Sweden is close to Finland, but the Swedes never take model from Finland. They think that's a colony far away and not any model for civilized people. And there was even a rather paradoxical situation in late 60s, early 70s, when the Swedish government and Prime Minister Olof Palme very strongly condemned American action in Vietnam. But Finland was didn't do that so openly as the Swedes did, because Finland would always avoid condemning Soviet bad behavior in international relations. And then they also avoided condemning the Americans, because then it would have been asked that why do you condemn the American action but not the Soviet action? And so the Finland was much more careful, which meant that for a short period of time the Americans thought favorably about Finnish neutrality and against the Swedes. They invited President Kekkonen to Washington and United States and all such things to teach the Swedes a lesson. So for a short period of time, the Finnish neutrality enjoyed a better Western reputation than the Swedish one. But that was only a small exception. And as for the Finnish leaders, they always, all the time, during the Cold War, they had this aim to be neutrals and to strengthen their neutrality and to avoid receiving Soviet assistance, as it was called, in case of a potential war. It was, in real terms, it was not considered assistance by the Finns, but the Finns tried to avoid a situation where they would have been compelled to receive this Red Army assistance against Western attack. And they developed various strategies to be successful here. And the first one was to try to get a Western recognition for the Finnish neutrality and try to get the West in a position where if they had to attack the Soviet Union, they wouldn't do it through Finland. And this was a constant thing to do. And for this, I think Finland remained in security and military terms silently cooperating very much with the West, especially in secret intelligence and things like that. And to be able to develop Western positive attitude to Finnish neutrality and to show that there are positive sides for the Western camp. And then the other strategy was for the Finnish leaders, and in particular for President Kekkonen. He developed various initiatives which were on the surface pro-Soviet, but included a secret or hidden agenda of strengthening position of Finland. In the meantime, there was this Nordic nuclear free zone initiative, and then much more famous, this initiative for the European Security Conference, which was made in 69. And there, on the surface, Finland promoted the Soviet idea of getting everybody to accept the post-Second World War borders in Europe. That was the main idea of the Soviets for the European Security Conference. And on the surface, Finland promoted this, but under the surface, they tried to strengthen their position, international position, as a neutral between the Western camp and the Eastern camp, and as a possible host of this conference and things like that. And also, President Kekkonen thought that even if the conference would not succeed or happen, meanwhile, when it was prepared, it would take years and it would protect Finland against Soviet pressure, because Finland was doing a good thing for them. So things like this, and the Soviets understood this, but they couldn't do much against that. And then others. There was a Finnish policy towards Germans, two German states. Finland tried to develop a situation where, because this 1948 treaty was written against a possible German attack, Finland tried to develop a situation where relations with both German states were such that you couldn't think any German attack through Finnish territory or those aligned with Germany. And then also under the surface of this 1948 treaty, Finland developed heavily trade, tourism, television influence in the Soviet Union. And the Soviets initially, they thought, and all the time, because they were so much bigger, they thought that all these areas, trade, television, tourism, would influence in Finland for their favor. But what happened in real terms was against this. Because in particular tourism, I think, because hundreds of thousands of Finnish, probably millions of Finns visited the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And I think it was percentually the population, it was the Western country where the greatest part of the population had seen the Soviet Union by their own eyes. And the Soviets thought, of course, that it would greatly increase their influence. But in practice, of course, the Finns saw that in realist terms, so they saw that this is a huge country and quite a culture and things like that. But also, as everybody knows who has visited Russia, that there are also negative sides visible for your eye. And so the Finns developed a rather strong negative attitude also for the Soviets, or realist negative attitude, which protected Finland, because pro-Soviet views were even inside the Communist Party. Finland had quite a big Communist Party. Inside the Communist Party, there was much criticism of the Soviet Union because they had been there and saw how it functioned or not functioned. So it helped a lot. So this is rather complicated, the Finnish neutrality. On the surface, Suslov, the chief ideological figure in the Soviet leadership, he said that on the surface, Finnish neutrality is smooth like a fresh apple, but inside it's rotten. And so it demands, and I think in this project we would wait to see more details of the Soviet attitudes and how they saw this complicated situation. And let's see what we are going to find out about this. We know the general lines, but there are much details that are obscure still. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kimmo. Finland is indeed fascinating, and I remember reading that that Urho Kekkonen once said the whole point of Finnish neutrality is to make sure that the treaty is never activated.
No, that's right.
So in this sense, the question is always a good one: neutral for whom or against whom? So in whose favor?
Yeah.
Let me maybe pass the word now to Peter Ruggenthaler and ask you, Peter, about what you found out on Austria and in whose favor was Austrian neutrality.
Thank you, Pascal. Since we do have a lot of students here, let me just briefly explain a little bit Austrian history. And in contrast to Switzerland, Finland, and Sweden, Austrian neutrality, which was achieved in 1955, was more or less a means of solving an international problem. Austria, as part of the German and Third Reich, was liberated in 1945 by the Allies, by the Americans, by the French, by the Brits, and by the Soviets. And with the liberation began the occupation of Austria. So Austria was somehow in a special situation. On the one hand, occupied, on the other side, the huge the past of being involved and taking part in Nazi crimes. When in 1945 Austria was liberated, no one believed, or it was not on the table, that Austria will be occupied for 10 years. The 10 years occupation of Austria is, of course, a result of the early Cold War. Ideas of neutrality go back to this time, but as Kimmo said, Austrians had learned from the Finnish example. While the Finnish example of neutrality was something like staying out of the Soviet Empire, not being transformed into a people's democracy. All these were at the initial phase hopes for some Austrian politicians that Austria could go a similar way as Finland. The most important thing for these circles was, of course, to end the occupation. As Mark said at the beginning, under Stalin, this was rather impossible. Stalin did not only have a very negative attitude towards neutrality. What does this mean? The example of Sweden showed him very clearly, or this was his impression, that it is impossible for small states to stay outside. There is no between, there is no real neutrality possible. This does not mean that Stalin didn't use neutrality as a means of foreign policy. Germany 1952, just to mention here. He also used the issue of neutrality towards Austria. But Stalin died in 1953. The process of neutralization began already under Stalin, which does not mean that this process would have ended successfully. It was the crucial change, of course, in the Kremlin leadership that neutrality came on the table as a means of solving the Austrian problem in Central Europe. It was Nikita Khrushchev who understood the advantages of neutral countries, of a group of states which would, on the one side, never join NATO, on the other side will not join, of course, the Soviet camp. And Austrian neutrality was more or less a price from the Austrian side. Austrian politicians and Austrian population was ready to pay to end the Allied occupation. From today's perspective, this sounds quite strange, since neutrality is seen very positive in Austrian population and became part of Austrian identity. Then back in the 50s, it was mainly the Austrian communists who did play a marginal role only, but it was one of the first parties who were more or less who did support the idea of neutrality. So neutrality then back for Austrian population meant a danger in being, and not only a danger, as seen from the Kremlin, Khrushchev, for example, and there were hopes in the Kremlin that neutrality would serve as a fertile ground for spreading socialism. For spreading socialism, for making Austria dependent on the Soviet Union. We do have files from Soviet archives who support these views, that there were hopes that Austria will get at least as dependent on the Soviet Union as Finland, especially in the economic era. These were, of course, illusions, but so were the hopes in the Kremlin. So in 1955, neutrality was, just briefly to explain, in April 1955, the Austrian government was invited to Moscow for bilateral talks. The Soviet Union was not able, of course, to oblige Austria to declare neutrality, but in Moscow, they both sides, Austrian and Soviet side, agreed that the Austrian government will declare Austrians' neutrality after the treaty, the state treaty, will have been signed. The state treaty meant to end the occupation, and after a short period of 3 months, on the next day, it was the 26th October, Austria indeed declared its neutrality on his own will. So it was an endless discussion in Austrian historiography, imposed from outside or on their own will. That's the situation how it came about. Kimmo already mentioned that the Austrians had learned a lot of the Finnish experience. This means, first of all, for Austrian governmental circles, that one can trust the Soviets. So one main advice was from the Finnish side, you can trust the Soviets, but just fix it all in treaties. And they are very reliable and so on. So the interactions of all the neutrals, this is something really left for the future. We do have some interesting comparison and studies already on Finland and Austria. Johanna was working on that, for example, but for the future, it would be really fruitful to do this also regarding Sweden and Switzerland as well, although Switzerland does play a less important role from this perspective, since Switzerland always was oriented towards the West very clearly. What, very briefly, just to conclude, this was more or less an introduction how the Austrian neutrality did emerge. For Austria itself, it meant it was agreed then that Austria itself will take Switzerland, the Swiss model, as an example. Austria itself broke this promise already in 1955 when Austria joined the United Nations. It broke it several times by joining other international organizations. But to add at least also the Western perspective, we do have also many chapters how the Western powers, the US, Great Britain and France, saw neutrality during Cold War. In 1955, there were also hopes from the Western side that Austria would serve as a model for Eastern Bloc countries. Austria does have a border of more than 1,000 kilometers with Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Yugoslavia. And in 1956, it turned out that neutrality, the model of neutrality, I'm not talking about Austria itself, but the model of Austria, also the model of Yugoslavia, did play a very crucial role in the emergence of the Hungarian uprising in 1956. Although the roots are, of course, others, but Hungary declared after the short victory of the Hungarian Revolution on 1st November 1956 to be neutral, and took Austria as an example. So for the Soviet Union, for the future and the further decades, the most important issue was to prevent the danger of this Austrian or Yugoslav model, just in order not to undermining the Eastern Bloc. Hungary 1956, Czechoslovakia 1968. The danger was still there. And this was seen from the Soviet perspective, and this is, I think, a crucial finding that the danger was really taken into account in the Kremlin, and that it was done everything to prevent this danger, which meant, in the case of Austria, similar to Finland, that Austrian neutrality would really mean during the Cold War what it became, to remain really neutral and better to keep silence on Czechoslovak invasions and so on. And so for the Austrians, it was a learning process throughout the whole Cold War, actually until the end of the Cold War, to understand what neutrality between East and West really means. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that explanation. And since Nadia is unfortunately not here to cover Yugoslavia, I will later ask maybe Tvrtko to do that, because I believe he also wrote a chapter on Yugoslavia. But maybe let me first ask Csaba, if you could come online and maybe just to briefly also discuss a little bit what Peter said about Austria influencing what then happened in Hungary, because I believe that your point is that the Hungary's push for Hungarian neutrality and taking Hungary out of the Warsaw Pact, some people might look at as idealistic, but you're saying it was quite realistic for the time. Could you maybe explain that?
Yes, well, thank you. Well, actually, the situation is rather complicated, because the general notion in the society after the Austrian neutrality was achieved was that Hungary could be the next. So the Austrian example could work in Hungary as well. So this, in the framework of the Warsaw Pact, in the framework of the Soviet Empire, this was an illusion. But still, a lot of people in the society were entertaining this idea, even before the Hungarian Revolution. Silently, because they could not talk about this, of course, before the revolution. But during the revolution, this came up abruptly as a kind of general demand. Both these issues, that is, Hungary should leave the Warsaw Pact, and then the country should declare its neutrality. These came hand in hand. These were two parallel demands which were spreading extremely fast in the whole country. So by the end of October, the general notion was that this is achievable. This was still an illusion, just like the illusion that the revolution can be victorious against the Soviet Union, because as Peter said, there was this kind of a period of the appearance of a kind of victory of the revolution, which was again an illusion, of course, which meant only that the Soviet troops were withdrawn from Budapest. That was seen by the freedom fighters in Hungary as a big victory, which was just, of course, a kind of tactical move. They didn't go out of the country. And even if they had gone out of the country, which was a possibility for one day on the 30th of October, the Soviet leadership made such a resolution. But even then, they could have come back anytime, and they definitely would have come back anytime if the stake was, or if the stake had been, as it was, to save the communist system in Hungary. So that's how they eventually decided to crack down on the Hungarian Revolution. And this decision was made on the 31st of October. It's very important because chronology is really a crucial issue here. So it actually preceded the declaration of Hungarian neutrality on the next day, the 1st of November. So even today, there are kind of illusions and misinterpretations, not only by everyday people, but also in scholarship. Time to time it comes up that maybe the Hungarian move, this unilateral move to declare neutrality and withdrawal of from the Warsaw Pact as a one-sided unilateral move, which definitely was seen in the Soviet Union as a terrible act by an ally, was the cause. The illusion or the misinterpretation is that this was the cause why the Soviets could not tolerate what's going on in Hungary anymore. In reality, it was exactly the opposite. From the time of the decision in the Kremlin on the 31st of October, the Soviet army was pouring into Hungary. with new units, and they were occupying all airports and all garrisons and many other things. I'm not going into this. So for the Hungarian government, it was just in a couple of hours, it was very obvious that this game is over. So they knew that there is no other reason for this than the Soviets are preparing a crackdown. And so the decision to declare neutrality the next day, on the 1st of November, was basically a kind of desperate move, to draw the attention of public opinion in the world, and especially in the United Nations, draw the attention to the events in Hungary, what the Soviets are planning. And Imre Nagy, the leader of the Hungarian Revolution, actually was hoping that this can buy time for him, which means that until there is discussion in the United Nations, perhaps until that time, the Soviet will not actually invade, as they did on the 4th of November, just a couple of days later. So it did not work, but still, under the circumstances, there was no other option for the Hungarian government. So in that sense, we can say it was an irrational move, because it was simply against the Soviet ideas and the Soviet interests, imperial thinking. So it was quite clear that the Soviet just could not tolerate this. That was no question. It's just a question of time when they will actually crack down on the Hungarian leadership. But as I said, in this desperate situation, there was no other choice for the Hungarian leadership. So that's why they tried to do it by this trying to buy time in the United Nations, and trying to force the United Nations to force the Soviet leadership to negotiate with the Imre Nagy government. And until such negotiations are in effect, perhaps the Soviets will not actually kill the Hungarian Revolution. But it was, as I said, an illusion, because the Soviets decided very soon that this should not be extracted, it should not be postponed, it must be done in a couple of days. And that's how the second Soviet intervention, which ended the Hungarian Revolution, actually was ordered and was executed on the 4th of November. So in that sense, that's the most important lesson of this story, that the cause and effect problem must be seen in this light. So it was not triggering the Hungarian neutrality. It was not an irresponsible act which was triggering Soviet invasion, but actually it was a reaction. It was a desperate reaction to an already ongoing invasion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xava, for this comment. Maybe let me ask if Tvrtko, are you there? Would you also want to say something about Yugoslavia?
As you can see, I'm not in the best setting, so it will not take me, or I will take just a couple of minutes. It wasn't even originally my plan to do this, but I could maybe just stress that. Well, in 1957, just to comment on Hungary, there was no other model because there was no non-alignment at that time. But bear in mind that Hungarian government went to the Yugoslav embassy. They didn't go to the Austrian embassy in 1956. And the contacts were already established much before Nagy decided to hide, or almost 20 people go to and hide or look for an asylum with the Yugoslavs. But Yugoslav story, of course, is a little bit different. Together with two other non-aligned countries in Europe. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I guess. Yeah, two other non-aligned countries in Europe, Cyprus from the day one, and then Malta from 1973 onwards, who were making that a special block of countries, especially Yugoslavia, was interested in having a European component within the movement of the non-aligned countries, or the global south, as it's called very often these days. That was a position that was not neutral in a sense of Switzerland or Austria. even when it comes to many other things like the armaments and other things. It was a little bit more flexible, I would say, bearing in mind that there were very many very different countries within the movement. I'm sorry I missed the first 20 minutes of the presentation, so I'm not sure who the audience is. I see just a couple of people on my phone. If there are other questions, I could maybe reflect to that.
Maybe the question is the influence of Yugoslavia in general on the Soviet Union's perception of neutrality. Do you?
Yeah, I was, well, the Soviets hated that because they, from the day one, I would say, were regarding Yugoslavia, and especially when recently I wrote a piece for a journal in Vienna, you know, they were regarding especially Mediterranean, when Eastern Mediterranean was gaining in importance or becoming more important for in the context of the Cold War. They were looking or asking for the Yugoslavs to allow them, Soviets, to use Yugoslav ports, which they didn't, permission they didn't get, to fly over Yugoslav territory, which they didn't get, but nevertheless, permanently regarding Yugoslavia as a country that used to be part of the Eastern Bloc, that used to be, after 1945, an ally, you know, which it ceased to be in 1948, and that tension was constant in Yugoslav-Soviet relations, regardless of whoever was. It's a tunnel, as you can see, Khrushchev or Brezhnev. Until 1988, Mark wrote a piece I quote very often when Gorbachev came to visit Yugoslavia in 1988 in early spring, March, I think. For the first time accepting fully two declarations, the Belgrade Declaration of 55 and then Moscow Declaration of 56, which were the basis for the relations between these two countries. So just as well as it was the case with other neutral countries, you know, the great or the superpowers were regarding any kind of neutrality, the Yugoslav or the Indian type, as well as the others, as much more problematic in the 50s than it was later. They learned how to live with or to deal with that. So the Soviets were always eager to disregard that, or to somehow hope that the Yugoslavs would return, or that they should actually be a part of the bloc, which, as I said, never really happened, in spite of the single party, communist party in power that was in Yugoslavia.
Thank you very much.
Non-alignment became one of the dogmas of the Yugoslav system, and paradoxically, the weakest one, paradoxically, the one that still, the movement that still exists, although Yugoslavia is long gone, as well as socialist self-management, all the ideas that were important for in Yugoslavia for the existence of Tito's Yugoslavia.
Although Yugoslavia is gone, Serbia today speaks of itself as a military neutral. So something's left.
Yeah, but during Tito's Yugoslavia, there were no Soviet or Russian soldiers on the Yugoslav territory, and today in Serbia there are Russian soldiers who do come there and have military exercises together. So that's says something about neutrality.
Thank you very much, Tvrtko, for this input. Although you're on the run,
yeah,
at the moment. Thank you. Maybe I'll move this. Okay, so let me maybe open the floor for a general discussion. Anyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment, please indicate that on your through the raise hand feature so that I can bring you on and let you speak. No raising hands, but oh, there it is. James Patrick, right, one of my students, please unmute yourself and let us know.
Hello. Thank you so much for going so into detail and sharing so much information about all these extremely complicated and nuanced differences of relating to historical events. I'm not personally too knowledgeable about any of these things, so it was very interesting to hear and learn about like the different like executions of neutrality, the different styles and effects and contexts that influence them, and the potential benefits and challenges and just everything related to that. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much for your comment. Let me, in that case, ask Shay as well. What is your question, Shay?
Yes, actually, this is directed at Mr. I hope I'm getting your name correct, Mako. And it's specifically regarding how I think you said that Sweden was neutral, but on the American side, and how many countries were neutral, but on the American side. Do you think that this is that historical reality is, or at least that historical analysis, I shouldn't call it reality, but that sort of historical analysis is partially tied to the fact that that those neutral countries were participating in the American capitalist system, the American global market system, and didn't want to be shut out of that?
Actually, it was the Americans who claimed or who described the Swedes as a neutral on our side, and of course it had to do with the European neutrals, in any case, being liberal Western-style democracies, and I think Western is a better label than American, even for the capital system from a historical perspective, even if it turns out or turns towards being American-led by the time of the Cold War. At the same time, I think it's important to make that distinction between military affairs and other levels of other political levels. So this secret military cooperation wasn't really acknowledged, and none of the neutrals described themselves or acknowledged. And sometimes actually, and also in the Swedish case, we know for a fact that this was the case. Even governments or heads of states weren't fully aware of the extent of military cooperation or intelligence service cooperation with the West and the United States first and foremost. So it's a complicated story, and there are very often secrets that even were kept from decision makers themselves. But at the same time, I think it's not wrong to say that as historians trying to understand the nuances of these policies, it is a valid argument to still distinguish between the relationship of the Western and Northern European neutrals with the West on the one hand, and with the East, with the Soviets on the one side, and the Americans on the other side. Just to give one example from the Swedish archives, just reading the documents yesterday from 1962, two of the foremost experts on the Soviet Union of the Swedish Foreign Ministry traveled to Washington, D.C., meet with people not only from the State Department, but also from the CIA, and openly report about this to the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. A long report about the exact state of superpower relations, about military issues, exchanging views on certain aspects of Soviet military capacity and so on. And this was completely unthinkable towards, of course, the other superpower. It's unthinkable to see Swedish diplomats traveling, exchanging papers with their Soviet colleagues in Moscow and discussing and reporting back to Stockholm such affairs in Moscow. So the distinction is there, but it wasn't acknowledged, and I think we still should look at the West and not only the Americans when talking about the Western Bloc.
Okay, so do you think that it's important in neutrality studies to distinguish, especially when it comes to the Cold War, to distinguish between economic cooperation and military cooperation, and as well as the West as a whole, NATO, and then America? You think?
Yeah, I mean there are these various levels, of course, and you have military affairs, you have diplomacy, you have the political relations, you have the trade relations, and these soft issues, multilateral contexts, where neutrality is dealt with in different ways. I think also the relationship between actually the neutrals and the non-aligned movement, the traditional, so to say, European neutrals and the non-aligned movement is understudied. But we do have to make this distinction and also keep in mind that what now appears obvious, what we now know about military relations, was largely kept secret back then.
Thank you very much for this input, and I see that Tvertko is raising his hand, so let me bring here Tvertko.
Yeah, just one sentence connected with this, what Marco just said. That very same phrase, I hope you are going to be neutral on the American, on our side. Eisenhower said to Tito in 1960 when he came for the UN Assembly in 1960, although or in spite the fact that Tito and 4 other leaders of the non-aligned, Nehru, Nasser, Nkrumah, and Sukarno, had their meeting in the light of everything that happened with U2 summit in Paris and the crisis between the superpowers. That's that.
Thank you very much. Maybe I have another question or something to bring in also for Arjo and for Peter, and maybe also to the others. In what way do you see also the Second World War experience connected to then the kind of neutrality, the way it developed, let's say in Sweden, but also in Austria, and also the Second World War experience of the Soviet Union? Because one of the things that I think we forget, or is quite easily forgotten, is that the Soviet Union during the Second World War was a neutral for 4 years with Japan. There was a neutrality pact signed in 1941, and Stalin himself was shaking hands with Matsuoka and told him all the best, etc. And that neutrality pact, which is not a non-aggression pact, there's a legal difference between the two. And the Soviet Union wanted the neutrality pact, not the non-aggression pact with Japan. And whether Stalin, his fatalism about neutrality also comes from his own experience of not also towards the end, not living up towards his own neutrality promises. And on the other hand, for Sweden, Östen Undén was a very, very ardent internationalist in the 1930s and tried to push the League of Nations toward actually finally punishing these non-conforming states. So did Östen Undén then also did this experience push him towards the stance that he took then in the 50s to his neutrality? Maybe Arjo first, and Peter, if you have some thoughts on Stalin.
I spoke so much, so I'll let Peter go first here, and then I'll come in.
Just going back to the last question, actually the Austrian army was rearmed secretly by the Americans after 1950. 1950, situation was the communists took over in 1948 in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and it was expected Vienna next. Now we know, of course, that this was never on the table, it was never planned by the Soviets, but the situation was anyway dangerous. Strikes on the street in Austria, the communists trying to use the situation and waiting for a coup d'etat, for a takeover. This is when the Americans began to rearm the Austrian army secretly. This was more or less then after 1955, the core of the Austrian army. From 1955 onwards, Austria as well was militarily neutral, but not ideologically and of course not economically. Regarding your question, Pascal, let me just add a few main points regarding Stalin's post-Soviet foreign policy regarding Germany and Austria. The most important goal for Stalin was, of course, to weaken Germany, at least to such an extent that Germany will never be able to attack the Soviet Union again, at least for the time being. It was clear to the Soviets, Germany has just after World War I did emerge so quickly. This was the main fear by Stalin. Just try to recall Stalin's words. The Hitlers are coming and going, but the German people will remain. Austrians, of course, were seen by Stalin as Germans as well. Austria was part, from this perspective, was part of the German question. Yes, when Stalin was talking about Austrians very positively, it was just a means of his policy, yeah, to separate these states, to force Austrian identity, to build Austrian identity, but mainly it was, how to say, security policy was a top priority, much more important than ideological questions and so on. So this also explains Stalin's attitude toward neutrality. He would never have trusted a neutral solution for Austria or Germany. He himself did spend, as you know, he was once in Finland, but never really went abroad. He took part in the conference in Potsdam and Tehran, and he was in Vienna in 1912 and 1913, sent there by Lenin to study the national question of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. So just to sum up your question on the influence or experience of the Second World War for the Soviet side is of course mainly determined by security issues. As seen from the Austrian perspective, the road to neutrality is quite a long one, and yeah, generally, of course, experience of the Second World War, but to a lesser extent to the Second World War as to the First Austrian Republic, which were seen more or less as a state which cannot survive. People after World War I were not really believing in this state. So it was mainly yeah, an achievement of all four great powers who succeeded in not only nation building, but also to help Austria survive economically. Just to mention the crucial Marshall Plan, Austria was after Iceland and after Norway and Iceland, how to say, Austria did get huge amounts regarding in relation to the population. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you very much.
I just add, Pascal, could I just add what this it's related to what Arjo and Peter just talked about, but also it goes back to the question that Jay Hagarara Finch raised, which is one of the things that became, well, two things that became clear in the book about the neutral countries as well as about Yugoslavia is that things they weren't static, is that the situation changed over time. And sometimes that was because of new leaders, especially in Moscow, but also within the countries. It did make a difference with new leaders. Arjo mentioned about Olaf Palme, for example, who was quite different certainly in his openness and eagerness to denounce the war in Vietnam. And by contrast, though, you find other countries. The one country that I think was most stable in its approach to neutrality, but also had major abnormalities, was Switzerland. Switzerland did not join the United Nations. In fact, it didn't actually do so until 2002, unlike all of the other countries. And it certainly did not join NATO or what became the European Economic Community or other such bodies. But it did play a very important role for organizations, especially connected with the United Nations, also played an important role in other international organizations. So there were many respects in which Switzerland was the most scrupulously neutral, but in other respects it was profoundly deviated from that. It harshly denounced the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956. It did not, by contrast, say much about the US war in Vietnam. It did raise the question at times, but did not engage in anything like the criticism that Sweden did. Switzerland also made no attempt to conceal its aversion to communism. The relatively small Swiss Communist Party was very harshly suppressed in the 1950s. And Switzerland also had secret contacts, as Arjo discussed. Sweden did. Switzerland also had secret contacts with NATO. Because Switzerland was not as close to the Soviet Union, it didn't go as far as what Sweden did, but it certainly had such contacts. It also, like Sweden, had a nuclear weapons program, quite an active one for a while. So there were many ways in which it justified on the basis of trying to maintain neutrality. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but even so, there were many respects in which Switzerland developed a policy of neutrality that was quite sui generis. It was one in which it was scrupulously neutral on a lot of things, but also was very clearly oriented toward the West on a lot of. And one last point on this is, Jay touched on one of the crucial aspects of this, which is discussed at length in the book, is all of the countries, with the major exception of Yugoslavia, were basically Western liberal capitalist democracies with generous welfare states. It's not true so much of Switzerland was much more in the Anglo-American model, but certainly with regard to the others, Austria, Sweden, and Finland. So that always set some limits on how neutral they could try to present themselves as being, but it at least in the sense that their domestic polity was very much oriented toward the West, even as they did try to maintain a neutral international policy.
Thank you for that. And maybe I have one thing to add here, which is that you're right, the Swiss policy was kind of sui generis at this point, but not without history. So the aversion of communism goes way back into the 1920s, and even during the Second World War, Switzerland did not yet diplomatically recognize the Soviet Union. That kind of is a very long history there. And on the other hand, Switzerland, even during the Second World War, rejected the idea officially of ideological neutrality, even telling Hitler that, look, we cannot police our own newspapers, and people are free to write what they want. When Germany kept protesting anti-German tirades in Swiss newspapers, so this idea that you need to be perfectly in balance between two was never, I guess, the idea of this neutrality. Also, the idea of economic neutrality was not part of that early understanding of the Swiss. And then in the late 40s, Mr. Bindschedler, a international lawyer in the Foreign Office, on only 4 pages, basically did for Switzerland what the long telegram did for the Americans, which is redefine foreign policy by defining Swiss neutrality in peacetime, because until now it was always contemplated under wartime, but in peacetime, which the Cold War was to Switzerland, it would mean not getting into any entanglements that could lead to war, to being dragged into war should shooting war happen. So that's that was a deliberate decision then also that was taken by the Foreign Office and served for a very long time as a basic policy, but that was not there before. Thank you for your comments, and I see that Nadia joined us. Nadia, would you want to say something about Yugoslavia? Do you have something to add? Can you unmute yourself? Nadia, can you hear me?
Yes. Good afternoon and good evening to everybody. Thank you very much for your invitation to take part in this event. I would like, yes, well, Yugoslavia is a unique case in many respects. The chapter that I was dealing with is focused on the changing relationship between USSR and Yugoslavia from the mid-50s, when the two countries partly mended the bitter rift that the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin provoked in 1948. And I'm through 1980s when 1980 essentially when Tito died. So I was trying to chapter this very interesting bilateral ties between the two countries in the late Stalin period and the post-Stalin rapprochement in the mid-1950s. And then to examine how the relationship between the two countries evolved in 1960s when Yugoslavia became one of the leaders of the newly formed non-aligned movement. The Yugoslavia is a unique case because this is essentially the only European country to take leading role in the non-aligned movement and became a leader in the early 60s and trying to have its own unique policy between East and West. In my chapter, I'm also discussing the meaning of non-alignment, what essentially was meant from a Soviet point of view, what was non-alignment from theoretical point of view, and what Tito and Yugoslavia meant during using the term non-alignment. I would like to say here that the Soviet diplomatic dictionary, to shed the light for the theoretical part of our discussion, in 1971 set down a definition of a policy of non-alignment. And according to that dictionary, the non-aligned policy was the foreign policy course, I'm citing here the foreign policy course and international legal position of a state in peacetime, which is characterized by abstention from joining any military bloc and grouping aggressive or defensive. I would like to say from the very beginning that Soviet understanding, no matter was a change during that period that I'm discussing in the chapter. But it was always different from Yugoslav leader meant using the term non-alignment. According to the Soviet understanding of the non-aligned policy, it exhibited an anti-imperialist, anti-war, anti-colonial thrust, which resulted in the great part of the non-aligned countries supporting, as it said in the dictionary, the resolution of the problem of universal and full disarmament, banning nuclear arms, the creation of atomic-free zones, the elimination of racial discrimination, and the proposals of the Soviet Union and the socialist countries on the easing of international tensions. As you can see, this is a very broad understanding of non-alignment, the meaning also neutrality, kind of neutrality. In the beginning of 1970s, the policy of non-alignment was considered by Soviet authorities to combine a characteristic neutralist opposition to military blocs with a progressive, as it said, anti-Western policy and support for Soviet-sponsored security proposals. Later, in 1973, a Soviet legal specialist provided a definition of non-alignment, which remained permitted by a concept of neutralism. In that legal definition, as requirements of non-alignment were listed as follows. I'm citing here: equal relations with the states of both socio-economic systems, non-participation in military political blocs, the elimination of military bases, and determining positions freely in a possible war of third countries. The understanding, as my colleagues mentioned, the colleagues from former Yugoslavia, the countries, scholars from former Yugoslavia, and also scholars from Soviet Union and now Russia and the United States, we all agree that the understanding of the non-aligned policies by the USSR and the definition it gave diverged greatly from the stance defended by Yugoslavia. Tito described policy of non-alignment as directed against all forms of, quote, foreign domination and exploitation, power politics, political and economic hegemony, and every kind of external interference and dependence. So terms clearly covered both Soviet and Western activities as an indirect critique of Soviet and Western policy. I can continue here, but I just wanted to say that I have been using a lot of sources, both from archives in the former Soviet Union archives, now in Russia, and also U.S. Central Intelligence Agency documents, also documents from Belgrade archives. And I would like to say that I don't know how many minutes I have, but the Soviet view of non-alignment movement was heavily influenced by Soviet relations with Yugoslavia, and Soviet officials for a long time they ignored the emergence initially of the non-alignment movement, but in the 1970s the outlook of Moscow changed with the much larger number of non-aligned members, and Soviet leaders, however, never accepted the non-aligned movement on its own terms, as they never accepted the Belgrade perception of non-alignment as such. I think that I can stop here, and maybe I can join later in the discussion, during the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this explanation, Nadia. We are nearing already the end of the of the entire debate. So I would like to give the word once again to the three editors, first to Ario, then to Peter, and then I would ask Mark to give a few final remarks about the whole project and also where you see that this goes from now on. So please, Ario.
Yeah, just very quickly in response to your earlier questions about historical experiences and whether they matter, I certainly do. I believe they do. The Swedes learned two lessons from the Second World War. One, neutrality works, just the way Stalin concluded that actually didn't work. But for them, it had been a way to, stay out of two world wars nonetheless. And two, you had to be able to defend yourself. So the reflex then was to offer to Denmark and Norway to form a Scandinavian defense alliance in 1948-49. But at the same time, of course, these more immediate historical experiences didn't wipe out longer historical experiences either. So the Swedes remained, equally fond of the Germans as such, and never feared, Adenauer or the West Germany, the way, of course, others did, and also never stopped, fearing the Soviet Union, and based on their historical experiences with Russia, based on the loss of Finland, which Kimmo mentioned initially. So I think that these experiences have to be contrasted with the longer history of each case of neutrality. As for the future, I do hope that we open up the consciousness among researchers that we need to include Eastern and global perspectives even more, and just follow the general trend also in Cold War studies to add these sources and perspectives to the Western sources and perspectives that have been dominating the field for a very long time. Thank you very much.
Very much agreed. Peter.
Thank you. So let me use not to conclude, but to tell you that we are currently working on another research project. We have been talking a lot about the research gaps. One really gap is still the period of 1969 until 1975. To the signing of the Helsinki Accord, the road to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. As seen from the Soviet side, Thomas Fischer, who has just left us, wrote an excellent book on the Western perspective, on the neutral power in the CSE process, and has been extensively working in US archives and other archives in Western Europe. So we are doing more or less now the other side, and on 10th September we'll have the first conference, hopefully in person. We plan to do it in person in Graz, Austria, and then we'll see, maybe another book will come out of the basis of the research done within this project in the next 1 or 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And Mark?
Just one last thing, which it's been touched on very quickly in a couple of earlier presentations, but the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union in 1985 changed many, many things in the Soviet Union and Europe, but one of them was the whole question of neutrality and non-alignment. Is countries like Austria, Sweden, etc., that had been eager to join the European Economic Community, but had backed away from it under earlier leaders, did begin to pursue it under Gorbachev, not initially with his explicit blessing, but certainly pushed it. There was no resistance really, or at least minimal resistance. And so at that point, neutrality began to erode. And then as the Cold War came to an end, the question arose about what does neutrality any longer mean. And so the period that we looked at was very much confined to the Cold War, because the kind of neutrality that is still talked about today is very different. And so I do want to emphasize, this was a period in which Europe was divided between two rival military alliances, at least from 1955 on, and de facto much earlier. So the period we're looking at is one in which countries did have a choice, and if they were neutral, it was a very conscious effort to try to stay out of entanglements. Today, it's quite a different situation, and so it's a couple of the questions that arose that touched on that. Is it's really comparing apples and oranges.
Thank you for that. In general, these neutralities seem somehow to be confined, the meanings of these neutralities, and seem to be confined to the periods that they're in. And with the Cold War, I think we have one very discrete period, and the one after, and the one also the neutrality concepts before seem to work differently. There's still these new research gaps that we have. Another one that I'm working on is on the neutrals and their position towards the NPT. What your book beautifully shows is that when you actually focus on these neutral questions, you don't follow the Iron Curtain anymore perfectly left and right. You actually do it cross curtain, and that gives interesting perspective. So anyone, I congratulate all of the authors to your contribution to this book, and the editors for bringing it together. And I encourage you all to get a copy somehow and get reading. Thank you very much for your attention and for giving
Target price.
Thank you, and goodbye to everybody.
Goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.